The teacup was beautiful. White bone china, hand-painted with a thin border of blue forget-me-nots, the kind Mrs. Alderton had inherited from her mother and never once allowed near the kitchen sink. She washed them herself, always with warm water and a soft cloth, the way other women might handle something they loved but didn't entirely trust. It sat on the table now, the cup, still and ordinary among the other still and ordinary things. The silver sugar tongs, the small plate of lemon slices nobody ever touched, the teapot with the chipped lid that Mrs. Alderton had meant to replace for 3 years, and somehow never had. Outside, the garden was doing what English gardens do in October. Dying politely, there were 5 of them at the table that Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Alderton herself, hostess, widow, 63, and with the kind of upright posture that suggested she'd once been told to sit straight and had never quite stopped. She poured the tea with the careful precision of a woman who considered tea a serious matter. Beside her, Dr. Raymond Fitch, who was not her doctor but had been her late husband's, and who had continued visiting out of what everyone agreed was kindness, though the precise nature of that kindness had been the subject of considerable discussion at the post office. Across from him sat Mrs. Gerald Bowes, Constance, who had been Mrs. Alderton's closest friend for 30 years, and her closest enemy for 25 of them, a distinction that appeared to make no difference whatsoever to how often they took tea together. Then there was the nephew, Philip Alderton, 29, recently returned from something vague in London, that he described as business, and others described less generously behind his back. He had his aunt's jawline and his uncle's habit of watching rooms rather than participating in them, and in the corner chair, slightly apart from the table as she preferred, sat Miss Jane Marple. She had been invited because Mrs. Alderton had once helped Miss Marple's garden boy find employment, and Miss Marple had felt it only right to return the visits faithfully ever since. She was knitting something pale blue, and had been for what appeared to be several months. She held her cup with both hands and said very little. This was, most people assumed, because she had very little to say. "Philip, you're not eating, Mrs." Alderton said it the way women of her generation said such things. Not quite a question, not quite a criticism, but somewhere in the narrow, uncomfortable space between them. "I'm fine, Aunt Helen. You look thin. I'm not thin. You look it." Dr. Fitch set down his fork. "He looks perfectly well to me, Helen." "You're a doctor, Raymond, not a mirror." Constance Bowes made a small sound that might have been amusement. Philip reached for a sandwich and ate it without expression. Miss Marple's needles clicked twice and were still. The fire crackled. Someone's teacup met its saucer with a gentle tap. Outside, a blackbird started up in the oak tree and then, reconsidering, stopped. It was an ordinary tea. That was the thing. That was what they would all say afterward, in various police stations and parlours, though with various degrees of composure, that there had been nothing unusual. Nothing at all. Just the sandwiches and the cake and the October light going grey outside and Mrs. Alderton pouring from the pot with those careful, practised hands. Though Miss Marple, if pressed, would have said something was slightly off about the afternoon, the way a room feels slightly off when a window has been opened and closed again. Not cold exactly, just different from how you left it. She noticed, for instance, that Constance Bowes had chosen her chair before being directed to it, had come in, assessed the table, and sat, a small thing. People often chose their own chairs. but Constance had sat with her back to the window, which meant she was facing the door, which meant she could see everyone's face, and no one could see hers clearly with the light behind her. Miss Marple thought about Mrs. Watts, who had done the same thing every single Sunday at the church socials for 11 years, and everyone had assumed she was simply particular about drafts. She wasn't. She was watching her husband. She filed this away. "I heard," said Constance, lifting her cup, "that the Redfords are finally selling." "The house on Vicarage Lane?" Mrs. Alderton looked up. "The very one. Mrs. Price Ridley told me. She had it from the girl at the estate agent's, the young one with the fringe." "Susan," said Mrs. Alderton, "is that her name?" "Her mother was a Hartley, from Aylesbury. Well, she told Mrs. Price Ridley that the Redfords have had the valuation done, and they're expecting quite a sum." "Doctor." Fitch poured himself more tea without being asked. "Good for them. They'll not get it," Philip said without looking up. "Property's stalled, whole county." "You'd know about property, would you?" Constance asked. Her tone was precisely, surgically pleasant. "I know enough. Philip's been dealing in investments," Mrs. Alderton said, in the voice she used to smooth surfaces, "very successfully." The small silence that followed was the kind that contains a word nobody says. Miss Marple reached for a slice of seed cake. It was Dr. Fitch who poured the second round. Mrs. Alderton had stepped to the sideboard to find the small silver strainer she was certain she'd put there, and he'd lifted the pot quite naturally, quite helpfully. "Shall I, Helen?" And she'd said yes, of course, Raymond, thank you, without turning around. He poured for Constance first, then Philip, then himself. He held the pot above Miss Marple's cup and raised an eyebrow, and she nodded, and he poured. Then he set the pot down and sat. And Mrs. Alderton returned with the strainer, and the tea went cold by degrees, and the conversation turned to the church roof, which needed £1,200 and was not going to get it, and then to the new butcher on Market Street, who was perfectly acceptable, but not quite the same as old Mr. Potts, who had retired, and then Philip reached forward and took his aunt's cup. Not his own, hers. "Yours has gone cold," he said without quite looking at her. "Take mine. I haven't touched it." Mrs. Alderton smiled at him, the specific smile she reserved for moments when he surprised her, and took the cup from his hand. "You see," she said to Constance, who had been saying something cutting before the interruption, "he's not entirely hopeless." Philip said nothing. He picked up his aunt's cold cup and held it loosely, not drinking. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Constance Bowes was speaking. Something about the church organist, a reliable subject, when Mrs. Alderton set her cup down very suddenly. Not loudly, there was no crash, just the abrupt setting down of a cup by a hand that seemed to have lost its intention mid-gesture. "Helen!" Dr. Fitch was on his feet. She was very pale. Her hand moved to her collar briefly, and then stopped, and she looked across the table with an expression of mild, confused surprise, as though something had been said that she hadn't heard properly. She started. She didn't finish. She went sideways, not dramatically, not the way people fall in films, but the way a person falls when their body simply stops cooperating. Gradual, terrible, and very quiet. Philip caught her before she reached the floor. Dr. Fitch was very efficient. He was that sort of man, useful in emergencies, admirable in crises, the kind of efficiency that left no room for panic because someone had already practically told panic it wasn't needed here. He sent Philip for the telephone. He sent Constance for a blanket, mostly to give her something to do, and he stayed with Mrs. Alderton, who was breathing, thank God, but very faintly. Miss Marple did not move from her chair. She sat quite still, her hands folded over her knitting, and she looked at the table. 5 cups, the teapot, the sugar tongs, the silver strainer Mrs. Alderton had been so glad to find. She looked at Philip, Eggy standing by the door with the telephone receiver still in his hand, watching his aunt's face. She looked at the cup, Mrs. Alderton's original cup, now sitting where Philip had left it, still full, still cold, still untouched. And she looked at Constance Bowes, who had returned with a blanket nobody needed any more, and was standing very still by the window, the light behind her, her face in shadow, watching Mrs. Alderton died at 5:20. Dr. Fitch said it was her heart. It might well have been. She was 63, and there had been, he noted, a history. But Miss Marple had seen a great many things in her 71 years, and she had seen women with heart trouble, and she had seen what poison looked like when it moved through a person, and they were not, in her experience, the same. She said nothing of this, and she accepted Philip's offer to call her a car. She put on her coat by the door. She said the appropriate things in the appropriate order to the appropriate people. At the door she paused, she almost always paused at doors, and looked back at the table. The teacup sat there, beautiful, blue forget-me-nots. The last cup Mrs. Alderton had ever used, not the one meant for her. Miss Marple stepped out into the cold October evening and thought about Philip's hands on the cup, and Constance's chosen seat, and Dr. Fitch with the teapot, so natural, so helpful, and she thought about the Purvises, who had kept the draper's shop on Lacey Street for 20 years, and how the thing about secrets, the real thing, was that they didn't hide. They sat right across the table from you, plain as anything, and waited. Inspector Slack arrived at 9:30 the following morning, which Miss Marple considered slightly too late and slightly too confident, the two qualities in a policeman she found most reliably inconvenient. He was a tall man, Inspector Slack, not naturally tall, the kind of tall that comes from deciding, at some point, that height was authority, and carrying the decision in the shoulders ever since. He had a good coat and a bad hat, and the expression of a man who had already, before entering the room, formed a theory. Miss Marple recognized the expression. She'd seen it on the face of the Reverend Clement once, during the business with the choirmaster, and it had cost them 3 wasted weeks and 1 deeply unnecessary arrest. She was seated in Mrs. Alderton's sitting room, because Philip had asked her to stay. I'd feel better, Miss Marple, if someone sensible were about, and she had agreed, because she felt considerably better about it herself. Slack interviewed Philip first. They sat in the dining room with the door not quite closed, which Miss Marple, positioned in the adjoining chair by the hall, found very helpful. You were close to your aunt? She was my father's sister, yes. And you've been staying here how long? 3 weeks. A pause. Approximately. Approximately. 3 weeks and 2 days, if you need the exact figure. I might. Slack's voice had the texture of a man writing something down. And your business in London? You said last night you'd been there on business before coming here. That's correct. What sort of business? Investments, property adjacent. Property adjacent. Another pause, longer. What does that mean? Exactly? Philip's answer was patient and complete, and told Inspector Slack almost nothing specific, which Miss Marple thought was rather skillfully done for a young man who'd looked genuinely shaken the night before. She filed that away beside the cup. Constance Bowes arrived at 10, uninvited, which was the only way Constance Bowes did anything. She came through the front door with the ease of a woman who had used it for 30 years, handed her coat to the kitchen girl without looking at her, and walked directly into the sitting room where Miss Marple was knitting. "I expected the police," she said. "They're in the dining room." "With Philip?" "They were. I believe they've finished." Constance sat. She was a handsome woman, 60 or thereabouts, with very good bones, and the kind of composure that either came from breeding or from practice. In Miss Marple's experience, those two things produced identical results and entirely different people. "Dreadful business," Constance said. "Yes, Helen's heart was never strong." "No," said Miss Marple. Constance looked at her. "You don't agree?" "I didn't say anything." "You said no in a particular way." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Did I? I'm sorry. I was thinking about something else entirely." She smiled, the gentle, vague smile that people consistently mistook for vacancy. "My sister's friend, Mrs. Hooper. She had heart trouble for years. Such a worry. She used to go quite grey, you know, around the mouth, before an episode." Constance was quiet for a moment. "Helen didn't go grey," she said. "Oh, no," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "She didn't, did she?" She returned to her knitting. Constance looked at the window. Dr. Fitch arrived at 10:15 and went directly to Inspector Slack, which was proper and expected. He'd signed the death certificate the previous evening. Heart failure, natural causes, consistent with history, and he came now, he said, simply to make himself available. Miss Marple listened to his voice through the wall. Clear, unhurried, professional. The voice of a man who had delivered bad news many times and had learned correctly that steadiness was a kindness. She thought about the teapot, about the way he'd lifted it without being asked. "Shall I, Helen?" There was nothing wrong with that. Men of his type, helpful, practiced, comfortable in that particular house, they lifted teapots. They refilled cups. It was the most natural thing. The trouble with natural things, Miss Marple had always found, was that they were extremely easy to arrange. Slack interviewed Constance in the sitting room, which meant Miss Marple was asked, pleasantly but clearly, to wait in the hall. She did so, and found the hall extremely informative. "You and Mrs. Alderton were close friends." 30 years. Constance's voice carried perfectly through the sitting-room door. "We met when I moved to St. Mary Mead. My husband had taken the practice at the firm. He's gone now, Gerald, 3 years ago. And Helen was one of the first women to call on me properly. You don't forget that. And recently? The friendship was still, we had tea every Thursday. Draw your own conclusions." A brief silence. "Were you aware of any difficulties? Financial? Personal? Helen was a private woman. She didn't air difficulties. And the nephew, Philip." The pause was perhaps half a second longer than it needed to be. Miss Marple's needles went still. "He's a young man finding his way," Constance said. "Helen was fond of him. Very fond. Despite the—" "She was fond of him," Constance repeated. The same words, the same tone, and something in the repetition closed the subject as firmly as a locked door. Slack spoke to Miss Marple last, which she'd expected. Witnesses of her type, elderly, female, positioned in corners, were reliably saved for last, which reliably meant the inspector had already formed his conclusions and was no longer truly listening. She found this useful. "Miss Marple, you were a friend of the deceased. An acquaintance, a friendly one, I hope, Mrs. Alderton was very kind to my garden boy some years ago." "You'd attended these Thursday teas before?" "Several times, not recently. I'd been unwell in September, and had rather let the visits lapse. Slack wrote something. And yesterday afternoon, nothing struck you as unusual, before Mrs. Alderton took ill. Miss Marple considered the ceiling thoughtfully. It was a perfectly ordinary tea, she said, though I did think the seed cake was slightly underdone. The centre. It sometimes happens when the oven runs cool. Slack looked at her. The seed cake, he said. Mrs. Alderton's cook, Edith. She's a good plain cook, but she will rush her baking. I've always thought, Miss Marple smiled apologetically. But that's neither here nor there, is it? No, said Slack, it isn't. He thanked her. He stood. He was, she could see, was already thinking about his lunch. Inspector, she said as he reached the door. He turned. Did anyone mention the cups? Slack looked at her steadily. The cups. The teacups. I only wondered, when the doctor is done with his examination, whether they'd thought to look at the cups. All 5 of them, including, she paused, fingers on her knitting, including the one Mrs. Alderton didn't use. A silence. There were 5 people. There would be 5 cups, she said gently, but 1 cup was exchanged. Philip gave his aunt his cup, you see, and took hers instead. So the cup she drank from wasn't originally hers. She tilted her head. I may be quite wrong. Probably am, an old woman fussing, but the cups were very fine china, and I did notice them particularly. Slack said nothing for a long moment. Or the cups have been washed, he said at last. Miss Marple looked up. Have they? The kitchen girl did them this morning, before 9. Ah, said Miss Marple, just that. Ah. But she said it in the particular way that made Constance Bowes look up sharply from the other end of the room. Even though Constance hadn't, as far as anyone could see, been listening at all. The kitchen girl's name was Dot. She was 17, wide-eyed, and had been crying on and off since the previous evening in the way 17-year-olds cry. Completely, and then completely stopped, and then completely again. Miss Marple found her in the kitchen at 11:30, ostensibly to ask for a glass of water, which she didn't want. It's all so terrible, Dot said, with the freshness of someone for whom terrible things were still terrible and not yet ordinary. She just went like a light. It's a shock, Miss Marple agreed. Had you worked for Mrs. Alderton long? 8 months, since February. Dot twisted her apron. She was ever so particular about her things, though. Not unkind, just particular. About the china especially. She'd have done my head in if I'd chipped one of those cups. She did love that china. I felt awful, washing them this morning. But Mrs. Henshaw from next door came in early and said someone ought to start putting things right. And it seemed I didn't know the police would. Dot looked suddenly stricken. Was I not supposed to? I'm sure it's fine, Miss Marple said, which was not at all what she thought, but was exactly the right thing to say. Did Mrs. Alderton have any particular routine about the tea things? Who set them out? Who put them away? I'd lay the table, and she'd choose the cups herself from the cabinet. Always did. Very specific about which ones for which people. Had her favourites she used for the good visits? Dot hesitated. She put out the forget-me-not set yesterday. That's the best one. Reserved for, well, people she wanted to impress, I suppose, or people she was. She stopped. People she was celebrating, Miss Marple offered. Maybe, yes. Was there something to celebrate yesterday, do you know? Dot was quiet for a moment. I shouldn't say, she said, which meant she would. Mr. Philip came into the kitchen Tuesday evening, she said, dropping her voice slightly, though there was nobody else in the room. I was doing the pots. He was on the telephone in the hall, door open, and I heard him. I wasn't listening. I wasn't. But he was talking about a will. Said something like, she's going to change it. I've spoken to her and she's agreed. And then his voice went lower. But he looked. Dot frowned, searching for the word. Relieved, that's it. He looked relieved. Miss Marple set down her water glass. Thank you, Dot, she said. And don't worry about the cups. You weren't to know. She sat in the garden for a while after that, despite the cold. The oak tree at the end of the path had lost most of its leaves and stood against the grey sky with the stripped, honest look of things in autumn. Philip was in the house somewhere. Constance had gone home. Dr. Fitch had left with Inspector Slack, talking in the low professional tones of men who'd reached an understanding. Natural causes. A woman with a history. A sad but not surprising end. Well, Miss Marple thought about the chair Constance had chosen. She thought about Dr. Fitch. And the teapot. She thought about Philip's hands and the cup switch. And the word relieved it. And she thought, she couldn't help it, she never could, about the Hargrove family who'd lived on Penny Lane before the war. 3 of them, all apparently devoted, all at the bedside, and the solicitor had been sent for on a Monday, and the funeral had been on a Friday. And everyone had said what a mercy it was, really, how peaceful, how expected. And it was only the youngest daughter, who'd been fond of chemistry at school, who had asked the question nobody else thought to ask. Not how did she die? Why now? Miss Marple pulled her coat tighter. Why now was almost always the right question. Mrs. Alderton had been about to change her will. Philip knew. And someone else, someone who stood to lose, must have known too. She looked at the house. Warm light in the kitchen window. Dot moving behind the glass, washing something ordinary and unknowing. The forget-me-not cups were clean now. Whatever they'd held was gone. But Miss Marple was not, by temperament or by habit, a woman who needed a cup to tell her what she already knew. She stood up, slowly, with the careful movements of a woman whose knees had opinions, and walked back toward the house. There were threads to pull. St. Mary Mead had a way of knowing things before it knew them. Not gossip exactly. Gossip required a starting point, a first mouth, a deliberate passing on. This was something quieter. Something that moved through the village the way cold moves through an old house. Not through doors, not through windows, but through the walls themselves, finding the thin places. By Friday morning, Mrs. Alderton's death had already settled into the village the way deaths do in small places. People spoke of it in the post office queue with the particular hushed energy of those who are sad and also, if they were honest, not entirely sorry to have something to discuss. The church roof could wait. The Redfords' house could wait. Helen Alderton was dead, and nobody quite knew what to think, and that in St. Mary Mead was practically an event. Miss Marple went to the chemist first, not because she needed anything, she had sufficient aspirin and her prescription wasn't due, but because Mr. Brent, who ran it, had been in St. Mary Mead for 40 years, and had the particular gift of all good chemists, which is to say, he knew what people bought and never said so, and sometimes, when the situation warranted, said so anyway. She bought a small tin of throat lozenges she didn't need and mentioned, as she counted out her coins, that it had been a terrible shock about poor Mrs. Alderton. Terrible, Mr. Brent agreed. He was a compact man with careful hands and the expression of someone permanently waiting to be surprised and permanently not being. Though not entirely, well, she had the heart, didn't she? She did. Miss Marple accepted her change. I don't suppose you wouldn't have seen her recently. She sometimes collected her own prescriptions, I know. Tuesday, he said. Tuesday she came in. Looking very well, actually, better than she had in months. He paused. She didn't collect a prescription. She asked me about something else. He stopped there. The professional boundary. No, Miss Marple respected it, the way she respected all fences, by finding the gate. She asked about medication, I imagine, she said pleasantly. She was always rather careful about that sort of thing. Interactions and so on. A sensible woman. Brent looked at her for a moment. She asked me, he said carefully, whether digitalis could be detected after the fact. He folded his hands on the counter. She said she was asking for a novel she was reading, a detective story. Miss Marple looked at him. And what did you tell her? I told her it depended very much on whether anyone thought to look. He met her eyes. A long, quiet moment passed between them, the kind that doesn't need filling. Thank you, Miss Marple said. The throat lozenges are very good, I've always found. She went next to the vicarage, which was not out of her way if she took the long route past the church, which she did. Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, a cheerful, scattered woman who managed to be simultaneously the best informed and least discreet person in the village, was in the garden wrestling with something that had been a rose bush, and was now ambition. Miss Marple, come in, I'll put the kettle on. Have you heard about poor Helen? Dreadful, dreadful, though Raymond Fitch says it was entirely the heart. He's known for years, apparently. Did you know she had trouble? I didn't know, though Mrs. Price Ridley says she'd seen it coming since August, but then Mrs. Price Ridley says she sees everything coming, which... Miss Marple accepted tea and a chair, and let Mrs. Harmon run for a while, the way you let a stream run before you step into it. And of course the nephew inherits. Everyone says so, though whether he deserves it after the business in London is another matter. What business in London? Miss Marple asked, in the tone of someone asking about the weather. Mrs. Harmon sat down, which meant it was serious. Well, she said, I had it from Dorothy Crail. You know Dorothy. Her sister married the Penfield boy. And Dorothy had it from someone in the city. I couldn't tell you who. That Philip Alderton had been involved in some investment scheme that had gone rather badly. Not illegal exactly, or not provably, but she lowered her voice by approximately no degrees. 3 families lost quite significant sums, and Philip had, apparently, seen it coming and moved his own money out beforehand. Miss Marple set down her cup. When was this? Spring, April, May. Which is, Mrs. Harmon added, with the satisfied air of someone completing a jigsaw, right around when he came back to St. Mary Mead, to visit dear Aunt Helen. Her expression managed to be both sympathetic and precisely the opposite. Who has, by all accounts, rather a considerable estate. Had, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes. Mrs. Harmon's brightness dimmed for a moment. Had. Poor woman. She stopped at the church on her way back. Not for spiritual reasons, particularly, though she wasn't opposed to those. She went because the church was quiet and had good acoustics, and she needed for a while to simply think. She sat in the 3rd pew from the front, which had always seemed to her the correct distance, close enough to be engaged, far enough to see the whole picture. 3 people at that table. And she laid them out in her mind the way she might lay out a hand of cards. Dr. Raymond Fitch. Knew Mrs. Alderton well, had known her for years, had the medical knowledge, had been the one to pour the 2nd round of tea. He'd signed the death certificate without hesitation. A man of efficiency, a man of access, but, and she kept coming back to this, He'd poured for everyone. If the poison was in a specific cup, he'd have needed to know which cup would reach which person. And the cups had been moved. Philip had switched them. Unless, of course, the switch had been anticipated. Unless the switch had been the point. Constance Bowes. 30 years of friendship, 25 of enmity. Mrs. Harmon's phrasing, not hers, but accurate enough. Had chosen her seat deliberately. Had watched the table. Had been the first to say firmly that it was Helen's heart. Why would Constance want Helen dead? That was the thread she didn't have. Motive was sometimes the last thing you found, but you did need to find it. And Philip who needed money, who had spoken about the will 2 days before his aunt died, who had switched the cups, casually, naturally, affectionately, and handed his aunt something warm and deadly and said, "Take mine, yours has gone cold." Or had he switched them for the opposite reason? Had he known what was in his own cup and moved it away from himself? She pressed her fingers together. The trouble was this: someone had poisoned a cup. And the cup that had killed Helen Alderton was not the cup that had originally been hers, which meant either the poison had been in Philip's cup, and he'd tried to pass it to his aunt deliberately, or the poison had been in Helen's cup, and Philip, without knowing, had accidentally saved himself. Two entirely different stories. Same gesture, same cup. The church was very quiet. A pigeon shifted on the roof above her. Distant, peaceful. Outside, someone was cycling past on the lane, the wheels ticking in the cold air. Miss Marple thought about what Dot had said. She put out the forget-me-not set, reserved for people she wanted to impress or people she was celebrating. A will, a change of will, a decision made, a solicitor to be called, a Thursday tea with the best china. Helen Alderton hadn't been hosting a normal Thursday. She'd been celebrating something, or marking something, or... And this Miss Marple thought with a small, cold clarity. She'd been saying goodbye. She went to see Mrs. Price Ridley, in which she'd been putting off because Mrs. Price Ridley was the sort of woman who required handling, like a very hot dish, carefully and with both hands. Miss Marple. Mrs. Price Ridley opened her own door, which meant the maid had the afternoon off. "I suppose you've come about Helen." "I'm afraid so." "Come in, then. I've said everything I know to that policeman, and I'll say it again to you, because at least you listen properly." This was the most gracious thing Mrs. Price Ridley had ever said to her. Miss Marple accepted it and sat down. "He came to see you, Inspector Slack. Yesterday evening. Asked me the same 4 questions in different orders, which I found very tedious." She poured sherry without asking, which Miss Marple didn't want, but accepted. "Wanted to know about the Thursday teas. Who attended, how often, or whether anything had seemed unusual recently. And had it?" Mrs. Price Ridley set down the decanter with a small, decisive click. "3 weeks ago," she said, "Helen telephoned me. Evening, around 7. She asked me, very carefully, very specifically, whether I knew anything about digitalis poisoning." She held up a hand before Miss Marple could speak. She said it was for a letter she was writing to her niece, who wrote crime stories. I did not believe her then, and I do not believe it now. "Did you tell the inspector this?" "I told him." Her mouth tightened. "He wrote it down and thanked me, and I could see perfectly well he thought I was a fanciful old woman." Miss Marple thought about Mr. Brent at the chemist, asking for a novel she was reading. Helen Alderton had asked the same question in 2 different places, to 2 different people, with 2 different excuses. She wasn't researching. She was confirming. She knew, Miss Marple said, not quite to Mrs. Price Ridley, not quite to herself. She suspected something, Mrs. Price Ridley said, which was more precise. Helen was not a dramatic woman. If she was asking about poison, she had a reason. Did she say anything else? On the telephone? Mrs. Price Ridley was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its usual briskness. Underneath it was something that might, in a less fortified woman, have been grief. She said, right at the end before she rang off, she said, "I think I've been very foolish, Evelyn. About people, that's all. I told her not to be silly. She said good night." The fire popped quietly. "Oh, that was the last time you spoke to her?" "Yes." Miss Marple walked home slowly, the long way, past the post office and down the lane by the old mill. The afternoon was going the way October afternoons go, sideways into grey, the light thinning without ever quite leaving. She'd been very foolish about people. She turned it over carefully. Helen Alderton had known or suspected that someone meant to harm her, had looked into it discreetly, in the way a private woman looks into things without making a fuss, without going to the police, without confronting anyone directly. She had changed her will, or agreed to change it. She had laid out her best china, and she had sat down to tea with the person she suspected. Why? Not to confront them, not to catch them. Helen Alderton was not that sort. But possibly Miss Marple thought of the forget-me-not cups, of the words celebrating, possibly to give them a chance to stop. A last tea, a gesture. "I know what you're considering. Here I am. Here we are. Don't." And it hadn't worked. Or, the other possibility, sitting quietly at the back of her mind, Helen had set something of her own in motion that afternoon. A test? A trap? A woman who put out her best china for people she wanted to impress? Or for people she wanted to watch? Miss Marple stopped at her gate. The house was dark, which meant her own kitchen girl Clara had not yet come to light the fire. The garden was end-of-season bare. A few late roses, brown at the edges, hanging on. She stood there in the cold for a moment, thinking about cups and hands and chairs chosen before being offered, and she thought about what she still didn't know. She knew how, almost certainly. Digitalis in a cup, detectable if anyone looked, if the cups hadn't been washed, if Slack had been a different kind of man. She thought she knew who. The shape of it was there, if not every detail. What she didn't know was whether Helen Alderton had died frightened or decided. Whether she'd gone to that table as a victim, or as something else entirely. That, she suspected, would matter very much before the end. There was a note on her doorstep. Small envelope, her name in handwriting she didn't recognize. Tight, slightly backward slanting letters, the kind produced by someone who'd been taught copperplate and then spent years trying to write faster than they'd been trained. She opened it in the hallway, coat still on. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you privately, not at the house. The bench by the old mill tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Please come alone. There is something about Thursday that nobody else knows. P." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket, where it sat against her hand, small and weightless, while she lit the lamp and put the kettle on, and sat down in her own familiar chair. P. Philip. It had to be Philip. Or it was meant to look like Philip. She poured her tea, in her own kitchen, in her own plain white cups, and thought about a bench by the old mill, and early morning, and a young man who might be a murderer, or might be a frightened heir, or might be, which she didn't discount, something else entirely. She thought about the Wentworth case many years ago now, the nephew who'd written a letter, who'd seemed so very guilty, who had, in the end, been the only innocent person in the house, simply because innocence had made him behave the most strangely of all. She sipped her tea. Tomorrow, then. 8 o'clock. The old mill. And somewhere in between now and then, she was going to work out which version of this story was true, because there were 2 versions, she was quite sure of that now, and only one of them ended with the right person held responsible. The wrong version was tidier. The right version was going to be considerably more uncomfortable. For everyone, but especially, she thought, for Inspector Slack. The mill bench was wet. Miss Marple had anticipated this and brought a folded square of oilcloth in her coat pocket, in which she spread over the wood and sat on with the practical satisfaction of a woman who has spent 71 years being right about small things. 8 o'clock. The village was just beginning its morning sounds. A door somewhere, a bicycle, the distant complaint of Mrs. Price Ridley's dog, who objected to mornings on principle. The mill itself stood behind her, long disused, its wheels still. The river beside it moved quietly, dark and certain, the way rivers move when they have somewhere to be, and no interest in being watched. She waited. At 4 minutes past 8, Philip Alderton came down the lane. He looked younger outside the house, or perhaps just more uncertain, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and his shoulders up against the cold, and he walked the way people walk when they're rehearsing something, slightly too deliberate, slightly too straight. He stopped when he saw her. "You came. I said I would," Miss Marple replied, which she hadn't, but it seemed the right response. He sat beside her on the bench, the wet half she noticed without the oilcloth, and stared at the river for a moment. "I didn't kill her," he said. "All right." He looked at her. "You believe me?" "I'm listening to you," she said, which was not the same thing, and he seemed to understand that. He was quiet for a moment. A moorhen crossed the river in the middle distance, busy and self-important. The cold sat on everything. "I switched the cups," he said. "Ah, you saw that?" "Yes. I switched them because mine had gone cold, and I'd barely touched it, and hers was fresh, and I thought—" He stopped. "That's not true. That's what I told myself. In the moment, that's the story my brain made. But the real reason," he rubbed the side of his face, "the real reason is that I was worried about her. She'd been odd that week, watchful. And before I came in from the garden that afternoon, before we sat down, I saw—" He stopped again. "What did you see?" Miss Marple asked. The river moved. A leaf turned on the surface, made a small journey, disappeared. "I saw Dr. Fitch," Philip said, "in the sitting room before tea. He'd arrived early. He often did. I'd noticed that. He was always there before me, before Constance. And I came in through the French doors from the garden, and he didn't hear me. And he exhaled. He was at the tea-table, just standing there, by the cups." "Standing by the cups," Miss Marple said, "for maybe 10 seconds. And then he moved away, and I came properly through the door, and made noise coming in, and he turned and smiled and said, 'Philip, good to see you, cold enough for you.' And it was all completely normal." He looked at his hands. "Except I kept thinking about it. All through tea. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And when Aunt Helen's cup was sitting there cooling, I moved it, without really deciding to, like a reflex." "You thought her cup might have been tampered with?" "I thought it was possible. I didn't actually believe it, not properly. People don't really believe those things, do they, until they have to." He looked at her now, directly. "And then she drank from mine. and she died, and I've been awake for 2 days, trying to understand whether I saved her, or whether I gave her the thing that killed her." Miss Marple looked at the river. "You didn't kill your aunt, Philip," she said. He let out a breath that seemed to have been in him since Thursday. "But you didn't save her either," she added gently. "The cup you gave her, your cup, the one she drank from, that was already poisoned. What you moved away from her was a cup that was perfectly clean." Philip stared at her. "Both cups? No, only yours. Dr. Fitch had 10 seconds at that table, as you said, and he used them purposefully. He put the poison in your cup, Philip, not your aunt's." "The river, the moorhen again, returning from wherever it had been. He was trying to kill me," Philip said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Yes. Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Because your aunt was going to change her will," she said, "which you knew. But there was something else in that will, something you perhaps didn't know. A bequest, a considerable one, to Dr. Raymond Fitch." Philip was very still. "She told you this?" "She didn't need to. I worked backwards." Miss Marple watched the water. "Your aunt visited the chemist on Tuesday, asking about digitalis detection. She telephoned Mrs. Price Ridley the same week, asking the same question. She was a private woman, not prone to drama, not prone to research. She was confirming something she already suspected." She paused. "I believe she had discovered, or been told, that Dr. Fitch was in considerable financial difficulty, in the kind that makes a man look at a will the way a thirsty man looks at water. How much? That I don't know, but enough. Enough that when Helen Alderton decided to revise her estate, to move more significantly toward you, which I suspect is what she'd agreed to, based on what your kitchen girl overheard, enough that Fitch felt the ground shifting." Philip put his face briefly in his hands, not crying, just containing something. "She knew he might try something," he said, "and she still sat down to tea with him." "Yes. Why would she do that?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that a great deal," she said, "since yesterday. I think, and I may be wrong, I often am, I think she wanted to give him the chance not to. One last ordinary Thursday. Look, Raymond, here we are. Here is the table, and the china, and 30 years of kindness. Don't do this. And he did it anyway. He did it anyway." Philip was silent for a long time. The cold moved around them. Somewhere up the lane, a door opened and shut. "There's something else," he said at last. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "there is." He looked at her. "You know about Constance," he said. She had wondered when he would get there. "Tell me what you know," she said. Philip leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking at the ground between his feet. "Constance Bowes," he said slowly, "was my aunt's oldest friend. You know that. What most people don't know, what I only found out on Wednesday, the day before she died, is that Constance had borrowed money from Aunt Helen. A significant amount. Over several years, a little at a time, the way you borrow from a close friend when you're too proud to admit how badly things have gone. And the new will would have formalized the debt. Aunt Helen told me, the evening before the tea, she said she'd decided to be honest about it, that the estate would note the outstanding amount, and it would be deducted from whatever Constance might otherwise have received. He paused. She made it sound very simple, very clean. You know how she was. Miss Marple did know. Constance would have known about this change. Aunt Helen told her, Wednesday morning, The day before." He exhaled. Constance came to the house, and they spoke privately for an hour. And when Constance left, Philip searched for the word. She was very calm, that particular kind of calm. The kind Miss Marple knew, is that sits on top of something else entirely. So Constance had a reason, Philip said, as well as Fitch. And she sat with her back to the window. She could see everyone's hands. Philip. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but clear. Constance Bowes did not poison anyone. He looked at her. She is a great many things. Some of them not admirable, Miss Marple continued. She is proud, and she has been careless with money and careful with appearances. And she chose that chair on Thursday because she was frightened and wanted to see everything, which is what frightened people do. She paused. But she loved your aunt, in the way people love those they've borrowed from, guiltily, fiercely, and not entirely honestly, but genuinely. And she had no more intention of harming Helen than I did. Then why? She was there for the same reason your aunt invited her. Because Helen wanted all of them at the table. Fitch, Constance, you. She wanted to see them all at once, one last time. Miss Marple looked at the mill, and possibly she wanted witnesses. The word settled between them like a stone settling through water. Witnesses, Philip said. Your aunt was not an unwitting victim, Philip. She was a very intelligent woman who suspected she was in danger and chose not to run from it. She laid her best china. She invited the person she suspected, and she made sure she was not alone with him. Miss Marple's voice was steady. The tragedy is that she suspected the wrong cup. She thought if anything happened, it would come through her own cup, through the normal pouring, easy through Fitch's access to the pot. She didn't anticipate he would target yours. Philip was very still. He didn't care if she died, he said slowly. He just needed me gone. With you gone, and the will unchanged, or only partially changed, yes, he would have remained a significant beneficiary. Your death could have been made to look like many things. A young man with failed investments, under considerable stress. She let the shape of it sit. Your aunt's death was an accident, a terrible, unintended accident. She picked up your cup, and Fitch, when he saw it, didn't stop her. The last words fell quietly. Didn't stop her. Philip sat with that for a long moment. He watched her die, he said. Yes. And then he signed the certificate. Yes. The river moved. The cold moved. Everything moved except the two of them on the wet bench in the early morning. Inspector Slack was not, it turned out, entirely beyond reach. Miss Marple asked Philip to drive her to the station, which he did, and she sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded over her bag and said very little, which was becoming a habit she didn't entirely mind. At the station she asked to see Slack privately, which his sergeant found amusing until Slack, who had learned something from their previous conversation, even if he'd shown no outward sign of it, said to send her in. She sat across from him and told him what she knew. Not everything, not Philip's fear, not Helen's deliberate table, not Constance's borrowed money, none of the human texture of it. Just the facts arranged in their proper order, which was a different order from the one he'd been given. The conversation at the chemist, the telephone call to Mrs. Price Ridley, the question about digitalis, asked twice in two places with two different cover stories. The cups, the switch, the timing, Dr. Fitch's finances, which she suggested he look into without specifying how she'd come to suggest it. Slack listened. He was better at listening, she noticed, when he wasn't in someone else's sitting room with a theory already formed. The cups are gone, he said when she'd finished. "Washed. We can't—" "The body isn't," Miss Marple said, "and digitalis, if you look for it specifically, doesn't disappear the way some things do." She held his gaze. "I believe the correct term is a targeted toxicological examination. I'm sure you know the procedure." A silence. "Yeah, I'll need more than a village—" He stopped. "More than a village lady's intuition," she said pleasantly. "Of course you will. You'll need Mrs. Price Ridley's statement, which she's ready to give properly, and Mr. Brent at the chemist, who will confirm the same, and Philip Alderton, who saw Dr. Fitch at the tea table alone before the others arrived." She folded her hands. "And you'll need Dr. Fitch's financial records, which I believe you'll find are rather illuminating, Inspector." She tilted her head. "None of this is intuition. It's observation. There's a difference." Slack looked at her for a long moment. "You should have been a detective, Miss Marple," he said, not unkindly. "Good heavens," she said, "I'm a villager. We simply notice things." She was home by 11. Clara had lit the fire, and the sitting room was warm in the way that only wood fires achieve, unevenly, generously, smelling of something older than central heating. Miss Marple put her coat away and sat in her chair and picked up her knitting, which was still pale blue and still mysterious as to its final form. She thought about Helen Alderton for a while, about a woman who had known something was wrong and had handled it the way she handled her china, carefully, personally, without asking for help. Who had washed the cups herself, always, because she didn't entirely trust others with the things she loved. The terrible irony of that, the cups she'd been so careful with. She thought about Constance, who would have to live with having been there and not understood in time. That was its own kind of sentence, and she didn't envy it. She thought about Philip, as who had switched a cup by instinct, and would spend considerable time deciding whether that instinct had been suspicion or affection, or some third thing that didn't have a proper name. And she thought about Raymond Fitch, who had stood by a tea table for 10 seconds, alone, and made a choice that could not be unmade, who had then sat and eaten sandwiches and talked about the church roof, who had watched a woman pick up the wrong cup and said nothing. That was the thing that stayed with her, not the planning of it. Planning was a kind of cowardice she could follow the logic of, even while finding it reprehensible. But the moment of watching, the stillness of it, the cup at Helen's lips, and Raymond Fitch reaching for another sandwich. She'd seen that quality once before, in a man in Downham, years ago, and the complete ability to be in two places at once, present at the table, absent from the act. She'd never found a word for it that satisfied her. Evil was too large and too simple, cowardice too forgiving. It was something in between. The choice not to choose, the cruelty of staying still. The needles clicked. Dr. Fitch was arrested on Monday morning. The toxicology confirmed it. Digitalis, at a level inconsistent with the therapeutic doses Mrs. Alderton had occasionally been prescribed for an entirely different and minor complaint. At a level that indicated administration. At a level that, had the right questions been asked on Thursday evening, would have been found at once. His financial records showed what Miss Marple had expected. A man quietly, methodically in trouble, and the kind that starts small and accelerates the way debt always does. And a significant bequest in Helen Alderton's existing will that had seemed, until recently, entirely secure. He said nothing useful. His solicitor said rather a lot. The village, naturally, had opinions. Mrs. Price Ridley said she'd always found something slightly off about him, and had said so, which was not true, but was not entirely false either. which is the usual condition of these things. Mrs. Harmon said it was simply devastating, and made tea for everyone who came to discuss it, which was most of the village over the course of about 3 days. The woman at the post office said you never knew, did you? And this was the most accurate thing anyone said. Constance Bowes did not comment publicly. She was seen once, was on the Thursday following, the day that would have been the usual tea, standing at the gate of Laurel House for some time. Then she walked on. Nobody approached her, which was either tact or cowardice, depending on who you asked. Philip stayed on for a while, sorting the estate. He came to see Miss Marple once, on a Wednesday evening, and sat in the chair across from her, and they talked about his aunt for a while. Not about the death, but about the person, which felt more important. Did she know she was going to die? He asked at some point. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that she knew she might. I think she decided that was less important than doing things properly. That's very like her. Yes. He looked at the fire. I keep thinking about the china, that she put out the best china. Miss Marple nodded. She always did. For people she cared about, she said. Even at the end she was being a good hostess. She looked at her knitting. That's not nothing, you know. Some people would have locked the doors and pulled the curtains. She set the table. Philip was quiet. Is that enough? He asked. Is it enough to just do things correctly even when— I don't know, Miss Marple said honestly. I've wondered that myself for a great many years, and I haven't arrived anywhere conclusive. She looked up. But I think the alternative, locking the doors, pulling the curtains, I don't think that ends well either. For anyone. He seemed to accept this, or at least to carry it with him in a way that looked like acceptance. He left at 9, and she heard his car on the lane for a moment, and then silence. The forget-me-not cups were not destroyed. Or this surprised people who heard about it later, that Philip had kept them. Wrapped each one carefully in tissue, put them in the cabinet in the new house where he eventually settled, outside the village, nearer London. He kept them because they had been his aunt's best things and she had brought them out for him, among others, on a Thursday in October. He kept them because they were beautiful. He never used them, but he didn't hide them either. They sat in the cabinet, white and blue, visible from the doorway of the room, small, ordinary, hand-painted with forget-me-nots. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what the flower means. Miss Marple finished her knitting in November. It turned out to be a cardigan for Clara's youngest, who had needed one. She started something new the following week. Something green this time, though she wasn't yet sure what it wanted to be. She sat in her chair by the window, and the village went on outside, busy with itself, full of its small, ordinary secrets. And she watched it the way she'd always watched it, not looking for anything in particular, just noticing, which was, in the end, the only thing that had ever been required. End.